Last year I went through an unemployment stretch, which isn't unusual, if I'm being honest. It's the plight of the writer, feast and famine. For every year of work, there's a bunch of months with a whole lot of nothing. Anyway, during these dry spells, I try to fill my time. So I was fixing up just about everything in my house that wasn't nailed down. Could have been using that time to rest, recharge, but I didn't feel like I'd earned it. I eventually got to my bedroom closet and was hauling away heaps of clothes I hadn't seen in a decade or so. I grabbed a fistful of some threads and was about to push them into a plastic bag when I stopped cold. In that pile was a dusty, almost threadbare camo jacket. Might not seem like much to you, but for me, that old jacket brought back a surge of memories so powerful, I got lightheaded. I felt my knees go weak. I had to grab my closet door and steady myself. That's what happens when you find something loaded with memories, especially when you aren't looking for it. It's like a punch in the gut. I looked at the coat, tried to find a pattern in its olive green hues, ran a thumb over the name patch. It said, Benjamin. I know him as Benny Driscoll. When I was growing up, he was probably the closest thing to a male role model I had. The most memorable one anyway. Since he also happened to be a dead man. You're listening to Run, Fool! I'm Rodney Barnes, and this is episode 59, The Border. Back in 1975, I was a young kid living with my grandma in Annapolis, which was nice. I love my grandma, still do. But I'd been restless, you see, because it was just the two of us. And as much fun as we had, I'd been hankering for a new energy in the house, to shake things up. Looking back on it, I realized I was seeking some kind of male role model, a father figure, if you will, who'd work on my basketball game with me, teach me all about growing up and the mysteries of manhood. I realize now it was an old-fashioned way of thinking, because there was nothing some guy could tell me that my grandma couldn't. But, hey, I was a kid, and it was a time when all that really mattered. So, you might understand why I was so excited when my grandma told me we were taking in a boarder that summer. For some context, the Vietnam War had just ended, and our boys were coming home. But for one reason or another, some of them didn't have homes to return to. Grandma signed up with some volunteers, offered up her amenities, hot meals, a cozy basement bedroom, anything that would keep these young souls off the streets. Lo and behold, a guy named Benjamin Driscoll took her up on it. Listen, I knew Benny. Everyone knew Benny. Before he went to war, he was the king of Annapolis. Star basketball player, handsome, charming, did charity. Helped his pop run their family plumbing business. Kinda your textbook town golden boy. Everyone always assumed Benny would grow up to be someone special. He was way older than me, of course, but I'd always looked up to him. Now he was coming to live with us. I couldn't believe my luck. Didn't really stop to think about why he needed a place to land, even though Grandma had filled me in. Apparently, while Benny was overseas, his family really went through it. The plumbing biz collapsed. His dad started drinking. His mom passed away from a sudden illness. What was left of the Driscolls ended up moving away, to be near some aunt in Virginia. So Benny was coming back to a whole different world than he'd left. I wasn't thinking about Benny's tragedy. I was thinking all about the stuff we'd do together, the things he'd teach me. I was sure it'd be the best summer of my life. So I was shocked when Benny finally arrived at Grandma's and stood in her foyer. Because he wasn't Benny. At least he wasn't the confident, popular kid I'd once admired from a distance. Standing in front of me in that foyer was a stranger. His gaunt, sallow skin made his cheekbones look sharp. His thin, willowy form looked delicate under an oversized camo jacket with his name etched onto a patch. It was zipped up to his chin. Vacant, haunted eyes peered at me, with dark bags smeared under them. Soon as we made eye contact, I felt something strange. I'll try to explain it. It was kind of like an energy, or a feeling. It made me dizzy anyway, almost like there was some kind of vicious liquid filling my head, making everything feel thick and distant. I blinked, tried to ignore it, and even though I was feeling all lightheaded, Grandma had taught me the right way to receive guests, so I offered to take Benny's jacket. But when I reached a hand out, Benny stepped back and crossed his arms. His previously dull eyes sparked with panic as he told me not to touch him. His voice held a note of anger. And that thing in my head, it got worse. Like there was a tidal wave of blackness seeping to my eyes from the back of my head. I could barely see. I was flooded with feelings too. Bad ones, like fear and rage and pain. Just as I was about to cry out, it was gone. Like, completely gone. My vision was clear. I was fine. I looked at Grandma and she stared back at me, a little worried. Nothing gets past Grandma, which was probably why she cut in. Said she'd make Benny tea. Before either of us could reply, she ushered Benny into the kitchen. Tears filled my eyes as I watched them go. Man, I was upset. I didn't know how, but it felt like I'd just blown my first meeting with the Benny Driscoll. And that humiliation was way worse than whatever toxic shadows had just converged on me. I figured I could say goodbye to playing basketball in the driveway or learning how to talk to girls. Benny didn't seem to want anything to do with me. But I told myself to take a breath. I blinked the tears away and reasoned. Benny was here all summer. I'd get another chance to make a good impression. I didn't get another chance that day, though. Benny just sulked around the house, barely saying a word to me or Grandma. At dinner, he just stared at the pork and beans Grandma made him, and then went down to his basement lair as soon as the sun set. I told Grandma I was going to bed, too. I didn't want her to see how bothered I was by Benny's silence, his rudeness, because I knew she'd tell me that being charitable didn't mean having a good time. She'd say it didn't matter if I was having the summer with Benny I dreamed of. We were helping someone out. That's what counted. I lay in bed that night thinking about Benny and replaying our crappy first meeting. It must have been about midnight when I heard something. A radio, playing in the deep recesses of the house. The basement, maybe, which meant that Benny was still awake. I pictured him sitting there, listening to it. Then I pictured myself next to him, bobbing my head to the beat. Every now and then, Benny would cut in to tell me about the music, or the war, or all kinds of things. Yeah, maybe. Maybe this was a good opportunity for a do-over. So, I got out of bed, crept down the hall, into the living room, towards the basement door. I stared at the handle for a minute. Then, I knocked on the door, but there was no response. He couldn't hear me over the music, so I opened it, said hello. There was no answer. The music got louder as I descended the dark steps. I could see a lamp was on in the room below. I got halfway down when I saw Benny through the banister, standing by the bed with his back to me. The radio was on his nightstand, blaring Symphony for the Devil. I remembered that distinctly, because what I saw next, well, it felt kind of satanic. See, I couldn't see all of Benny, since the banister rods were close together. But from what I could make out through the crack, Benny wasn't wearing his camo jacket, the one he'd been so protective over. And when he turned around, I understood why. He had no torso. I don't mean that figuratively. I made his entire chest look like it had been blown to bloody shredded bits. His ribs hung, shattered, and fragmented from his spinal cord. Flaps of skin were loose on either side of his body. I could see the lamp through his chest. There wasn't an organ left in place. No heart, no stomach, nothing. There was only one logical explanation for why he would look like that. Benny Driscoll was dead. The start of a new year is the perfect time to get organized. Set goals and prioritize what matters most. For me, a top priority is my financial wellness, which feels more important than ever. Thanks to Rocket Money, my goals feel achievable. They show me all of my subscriptions right in one place and help me easily cancel ones that I forgot I've been paying for. Rocket Money also pulls together all of my spending across all of my different accounts so I can clearly track my spending habits and see where I can cut back. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/run today. That's rocketmoney.com/run. rocketmoney.com/run. He had to be. But somehow, despite the grotesque carnage, he was standing in my grandma's basement, listening to music. Even though he turned around, it didn't seem like he'd seen me, which was good, because I couldn't run. My whole body was completely rigid, locked up tight by shock and fear. I tried not to panic, to breathe, and gather the courage to slowly back up the stairs, making sure to keep my eyes on Benny's ragged form through the banister rods. Finally, when I got to the top, I ran. I sprinted through the quiet, dark house and into my bedroom. I closed the door behind me, locked it, and leapt into my bed, yanking my Spider-Man covers over me. Funny how a kid's bed is such a safe haven. Like the cotton sheets are armor that can protect them from whatever monsters lurk in the shadows. Anyway, I lay under those covers, shaking like a leaf. I wanted to get to Grandma, but I couldn't move. What if Benny was out there, in the hall, with his rancid guts spewing out of that godforsaken hole in his chest? Maybe he was going to kill me too. Maybe he'd hurt Grandma. That's what made me decide it was worth the risk. I had to warn her about Benny. So I threw my covers off and got out of bed. But I didn't make it to the door, because there was someone in my way. Benny was just inside my room, leaning against the closed door. He had his jacket back on, his hands pulled it tight around his collar. But I didn't need to see the gore. I remembered it, and it made my stomach lurch. Benny's eyes were wide. A bead of sweat traveled down his hairline and gently got lost in his raised eyebrows. His mouth hung open slightly, like he wanted to speak, but he didn't. Neither did I. I was too scared. And seconds later, everything got worse. Remember that dark muck that seeped into my head in the foyer? That happened again. Along with it, a hot, wet breeze whipped around me, making my whole body break out in goosebumps with that sludgy wind. I felt a searing terror that filled me with a horrific certainty. I was going to die. At the same time, I tasted blood, metallic and warm. My mouth was full of it. Before I could scream, I heard someone else do it for me. A life-ending, ravenous shriek. Then another one. A chorus of the dying, coming from inside my head, being carried through my mind on that wave of oily muck, while Benny just stood there, staring at me. The darkness on the edge of my vision crept in further and further, until all I could see was the black. All I could hear were the screams, and all I could taste was blood. And then, it was morning. I blinked. I was lying in bed. As light streamed through my window, I shot up to look at the door, but Benny wasn't there. I felt fine, too. No blood in my mouth, no adrenaline or panic. Even so, I didn't second-guess myself. I had a kid's naivety, you see. I knew something had happened last night. Something dark. I could hear Grandma moving around in the kitchen, and seconds later, I was on my feet, ready to tell her about the rotten cancer we'd invited into our home. I raced into the kitchen, but when I got there, I realized I was too late. Benny sat at the breakfast table, eating eggs with Grandma, jacket on. He seemed like he was in a better mood than before. He smiled at me when I came in. That's when I got confused. Because in the light of day, staring at Benny, well, he seemed kind of normal. And it filled me with doubt, you know? It was hard to square away the wraith-like corpse from last night with the real-life man sitting at our table. So, instead of blurting out a warning, I hesitated. 'Cause what if I was wrong? If I told Grandma that some decrepit, rotting corpse was living in her basement, Benny would be out of there faster than I could blink. Sure, I'd seen his cavernous, bloody chest. I'd felt that horrific black cloud he brought with him. But what if it had been a dream? Then an innocent guy would be out on the streets with nowhere to go, all because of my overactive imagination. You have to understand, it was the reasoning of a child. I'd make a different choice today, but back then, I was a scared kid who didn't want to let anyone down. So I decided before I said anything, I needed to be sure. Later that day, Benny said he had an errand. I decided to follow him, see what I could learn. I told Grandma I was going to my best friend Nikki's. Then I flew out the door. I hustled to catch up to Benny outside, but made sure to keep a few steps behind. He didn't turn around and check. I focused on the back of his head as we wound through the streets of Annapolis, the neighborhoods on either side of the busy thoroughfares, until finally, he stopped, and I realized where we were. At Grandma's. Yeah, Benny had done a loop. I was so intent on following him, I didn't even notice. When I looked at Benny, he seemed just as confused as I was. He stared at Grandma's house, frowning. Then I saw his shoulders tense, his fists clench, his back went rigid. It seemed like he was panicking. I took a step closer and wished that I hadn't. That inky glaze filled my vision, and a flurry of screams rose around me. Gunfire boomed in my ears as my adrenaline spiked. I shut my eyes as my skin flushed. It was hot, really hot, like it was burning. Then, the sensation was gone as quickly as it came. I opened my eyes. All I could see was Benny. He stood right in front of me. His bloodshot eyes peered into mine like he was looking deep into my soul. When I glanced down, I saw his jacket hung loose. His guts were just barely exposed like a peekaboo window into a rotten abyss. I could even smell him, a whiff of guts and baked meat, a warm rot that churned my stomach and made my eyes water. Then he yelled, spewing flecks of spit onto my cheeks. He cried, "I can't find anything!" I stepped backwards, nearly tripping over my feet. In some wild attempt to get away, I managed to stagger towards Grandma's walkway in a clumsy panic. I needed to just get into the house where Grandma would keep me safe from the monster wearing Benny Driscoll's face. I flew towards the front door and slammed it behind me. I leaned against it, hyperventilating. I called out for Grandma, but there was no answer. I saw a piece of paper on the coffee table. It was a note from Grandma. It said I was probably still at Nikki's, but in case I wasn't, she'd gone to the store. My stomach flipped. Grandma was gone. Benny was outside, and he was probably going to try to get in and rip me apart. Maybe turn me into a walking corpse just like him. I swallowed. Nerves made my vision go blurry. Then, the door handle turned. I gasped, trying to tell myself that it was locked. But look, I was no dummy. I'd heard enough of Grandma's stories to know that the beast always gets in, sooner or later, which meant I didn't have a lot of time to decide if I was going to be brave and fight back or if I was going to cower and hide. It wasn't really a choice. In the end, I was an anxious kid, but I've never been the kind of person who gave up easily. And you know what? Like I said, I've been hankering for a hero in my life, a role model, and for the first time I thought, I just have to be my own. But my confidence faltered just a second later when I saw Benny's hand reaching through my grandma's front door. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. We always hear about red flags, the warning signs to avoid in relationships. But what about green flags, the signs that you're on the right track with a friend or partner? If you're not sure what they look like, therapy can help. It's a space to identify green flags, practice them in your relationships, and even become the green flag yourself. Like me, I'm the greenest of flags. Whether you're dating, married, building friendships, or just working on you, it's time to invest in relationships that love you back. I've been in therapy for 2 decades, and I believe the cornerstone of health is mental health. BetterHelp is fully online, making therapy affordable and convenient, serving over 5 million people worldwide. Access to a diverse network of more than 30,000 credentialed therapists with a wide range of specialties. Easily switch therapists anytime at no extra cost. Discover your relationship green flags with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/run to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/run. It wasn't long before the rest of Benny followed. Elbow, arm, shoulders, head. Yeah, Benny was an undead thing, so I guess a locked door wasn't too much of an obstacle. My instincts kicked in. They told me to run, which was good. They also told me to head to the basement, which was bad. That was Benny's lair. Didn't have time to think about it. That was the closest door to me, so I shot towards it and flew down the stairs. I knew I had a steel baseball bat down there, shoved in the back of a closet, so that's the first thing I did. I frantically flung open the storage door and reached in, my hands wrapped around the cool handle. Then I ducked behind the bed and waited while I tried to quiet my ragged breathing and make some kind of plan. Moments later, I heard boots come down the stairs, a careful, firm tread that reached the bottom and moved across the room, then stopped on the other side of the bed. I peered under the frame. I could see his shoes, standing there, pointed towards me. Then, his camel jacket fell to the floor. His feet turned around, and the bed springs sank as he took a seat. My heart was beating so hard I thought I'd break a rib. The bed felt slick in my hand. Benny didn't seem to know I was there. Judging by his shoes, he was facing away from me, so I could use this moment to smash his head with the bat. I closed my eyes, feeling the nerves rise in my chest, reminding myself that I could be brave, strong, just like the guy Benny used to be. So I counted to 3 and shot to my feet, bat raised. I'd make a mistake. Benny was waiting for me. As soon as I popped up, his hand lashed out and grabbed a hold of my throat. I felt the bat fall from my hands as I gasped in surprise. His cold fingers squeezed tighter and tighter. I tried to scream, but nothing came out, not even my breath. I choked, gasping for air. My hands scraped at Benny's ice-cold arms. As he peered out at me, he didn't look angry anymore. He looked devastated, almost frantic. In a low, croaking voice, he suddenly hissed out a question. Why was everything different? I gaped at him, because in spite of not being able to breathe, I still had the mental capacity to realize what his question meant. Benny didn't know he was dead. I managed to croak out a reply, a raspy whisper. Let me go, and I'll tell you. Almost instantly, his grip released, and I dropped to the ground. I sputtered, choking, heaving, as Benny sat back on the bed, staring at me in anticipation. I massaged my throat, coughed. I was buying myself some time. See, I wasn't sure if I should tell him the truth. If he knew he was deceased, would he fly into a rage? Kill me? So I decided to stall. I asked him to tell me the last thing he remembered. Benny frowned, closed his eyes like he was trying to piece it all together. He said that he was in the jungle. He heard a loud click, and then there was an explosion. Everything got hot, incinerating. Then his world went white, and he couldn't see anything. Next thing he knew, he was on a bus, driving into Annapolis. But nothing was how he left it. He couldn't find his family, or his house, and he was clearly injured, but couldn't feel any pain. Then he started to cry, big gasping tears. His hand shook. So did his tattered shoulders. The big gobs of flesh that hung to his ribs spluttered as he cried, blubbering out that he didn't know what to do. He always used to, And now, he had no idea. So yeah, that was it. What had happened to poor old Benny? He died in that war. And for whatever reason, he got lost in that space between life and death. In his confusion, a force greater than Benny led him home to meander around in search of his old life. Damn, I remember that moment. All I could think about was the Benny I'd once admired, the kid who charmed our whole city with his sparkle. That kid was stuck and needed something to shake him loose. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd be the one helping Benny Driscoll. But I knew that's exactly what I needed to do. So even though I was scared, and I still didn't know how he'd react, I reminded myself that I decided to be brave. So I took a breath and told him the truth. The simple, devastating truth. I said, "Benny, you're dead." Benny looked at me with waterlogged eyes. At first, he was surprised, then sad. After that, he smiled. A big smile. 'Cause as crappy as it was to be dead, it was even worse to be drifting around, with no idea why everything was strange. That's when I finally saw him, Benny Driscoll, the guy I remembered, the guy everyone always spoke about, who was sweet and talented and full of that kind of special sauce that only comes around once in a blue moon. Seconds later, he closed his eyes. His whole silhouette shimmered and rippled, then very slowly faded away. His jacket fell in a crumpled heap on the bed. I stared at the camo, wondering where he went. Sad he was gone, but hopeful that he was finally done wandering through the remnants of his old life. I looked down at the jacket in my lap, ran my hand over its fabric again. The rough, heavy material scratched my palm. My time with Benny was a formative experience in more ways than one. Every generation gets a hometown hero. Benny was ours. He was mine, just not in the way that I thought he was. See, being brave isn't flashy. It's not about violence or gunfire. It's quiet and small. It's about accepting the hand you've been dealt and figuring out how to move forward in spite of a bad one. That's why Benny was the bravest person I knew. Not because he signed up for some war, but because when I told him he was dead, it didn't destroy him. In fact, it seemed to save him. I folded the jacket and put it back in my closet, in a nicer spot this time, where I could see it, and it wouldn't be forgotten for another 5 years. After that, I went to the living room, made myself some tea, and put my feet up. If Benny could stop wandering and finally rest, so could I. Except, I had no idea that when Benny left me that day, his journey wasn't over. 'Cause not long after he closed his eyes and vanished into thin air, he opened them again. But he wasn't in my grandma's basement anymore. He was in a forest, a jungle, full of rubber trees, that extended up into a canopy of greenery. The humidity in the air was so thick Benny felt like he'd been hit in the face with a wet towel. All around him, men in uniform crouched behind trees. Boys, just like him. They lay under logs. More than one, if not all, had guns in their hands, raised, pointed through the dense brush. A guy who must have been the group leader held up a fist, then made a gesture that indicated everyone should follow him. He moved forward in a crouch. Benny realized where he was and what it meant. He was back in that familiar jungle, the one that would haunt him forever, the woods of Vietnam. Not only that, he recognized these particular trees, the specific signal of the group leader, the amiable face of one of his comrades, crouched near a shrub beside him. This was the moment that he died. Yeah, just minutes from now, the soldier by the shrub would step on an unfortunately placed landmine and blow their entire party to bits of bone and dust. Benny remembered hearing the roar, seeing a white light, and then, the next minute, he was on a bus, heading to Annapolis, with no idea he died until I filled him in. Benny could feel the sweat pouring down his face. He could taste its salt on his lips. He could hear the breath of the other soldiers, the gentle rustle as they began to follow their leader. So this wasn't a memory. It was real, which meant he was getting a second chance. Benny's pulse raced. He had mere seconds to warn his fellow soldiers and save all of their lives. He whipped around, mouth open, a desperate plea in his throat. But that soldier had already moved from his spot by the brush. He strode towards the group leader, following the rest of the party. And before Benny could shout any kind of anything, he heard it. The last sound he remembered before appearing on that bus. A click. His fellow soldiers stared down, doom written all over his face. He had just enough time to look up and meet Benny's eyes. It was... They both had just enough time to know it was over, but not enough to do anything about it. So all they could do was look at one another and hope to God there was something better waiting for them. A hot, wet breeze whipped around Benny. He felt a searing terror, one that filled him with a horrific certainty. He was going to die. Again. The boom of the explosion felt even louder this time around. A blazing wave of fire slammed into Benny. This time, there was no blackout. No confusing scenery change. Benny felt every bit of that fiery wrath tear apart his torso, melt his skin, and rip his organs out of his chest. It was a torturous pain that made his nerves rupture and his senses short. His mouth filled with gobs of warm metallic blood. A symphony of screams rose around him as the rest of the soldiers were engulfed in fire. And then, it was over. Everything was quiet. The pain was gone. At first, Benny wondered if he imagined the whole thing, but a quick look told him that that wasn't the case. The explosion had made a clearing in the woods, encircled by burning brush. On the forest floor, the remnants of his fallen party lay in tatters. It was... I don't need to tell you how bad it was. At Benny's feet was his corpse. His chest had been blown to bits. Above that, his face stared out into nothing, a vacant, slightly surprised expression still on it. Benny's eyes filled with tears, because it was wretched, seeing his own dead face there in the mud. But also, he thought he'd moved on already. Now here he was, doing it again. Maybe he was doomed to die and wander. Die and wander. For eternity. Maybe this was punishment for taking lives, for leaving his family behind. But Benny didn't get much time to think about all that, because seconds later, he started walking. It wasn't that he wanted to. A force compelled him to do so. It rushed through his limbs, making him go rigid. Felt sort of like a thread traveling through his bones, pulling on his legs and moving them forward like a puppet on strings. He walked silently through the trees. Took him all of 2 seconds to realize he wasn't alone. All around him, around the jungle, the figures of his fellow soldiers rose out of their own corpses. They stepped forward, silent and steady. Their faces looked alarmed, but their limbs moved with confidence in the same direction as Benny. The ghost of Benny's unit merged together till they made a single file line. Benny was towards the back. Then, They stomped forward. A march of the damned. As they walked, the forest faded away. It didn't really disappear, it just got dark, so that the trees loomed around them like monstrous shadows. It made Benny's stomach turn. A nauseating dread rose up inside him. His mind reeled, trying to figure out how to get out of this line, away from the force that was urging him onwards, to who knows where. Then he heard a moan. It came from the dark woods. His head couldn't turn to the side. He just had to listen. As the moan came again, more devastating, mournful croons joined it, surrounding Benny as he walked on, through the darkening forest, until he suddenly stopped. The rest of the line did too. On either side of them, Benny couldn't see the trees anymore. It was just darkness. And from that seemingly eternal pit of black came those moans. Soon, they transformed into screams. Painful, visceral ones. It set Benny's teeth on edge and made his eardrums ache. All of a sudden, the cries settled until Benny could only hear a single scream. It came from the head of the line. As soon as Benny realized this, the scream got cut off, like something had silenced it. Then, his body moved, unbidden, ordered by the force that had a hold of him. It made him take a single step forward. He stopped. Another scream came from the front of the line. Seconds later, it was cut off, and he was forced to take another step. Then, there was another scream. Something was knocking off the soldiers one by one down the line, and Benny was trapped in a death march straight towards something he couldn't see. There was no saving himself, no breaking free. He had to just wait, as whatever egregious thing at the front of the line ate up his comrades. A scream. Silence. Another step. A scream. Silence. Another step. Scream. Silence. Another step. Finally, the next scream came from the man right in front of him and made Benny's stomach flip. He still couldn't see what was happening. All he knew was that the man's wail was cut off, and he disappeared. Just poof. No ceremony, no honor, just gone. Benny tried to resist, but his body moved on without his say-so. Up a step. Into the dark. At first he didn't see anything, but then he was blinded. A white, shining light burst through the black, right into his eyes. As soon as it did, his body relaxed. That horrific force that had taken hold of him suddenly let go. He shrugged his shoulders, moved his hands and feet, relieved to be in control of his own body again. Then he squinted up at the light. A feeling of bliss washed over him, because that light, it called to him, like a gentle song. It reminded him of all the things he loved, a basketball swishing through a net, dinner with your buddies, where you eat good food and drink good beer, and laugh. A cool breeze on a sunny day. His high school crush, Stacy Morton's smile. Benny took a step towards the light. He felt tears prick at the corner of his eyes. As an epiphany hit. This was a second chance, but not at living, at dying. This time, Benny hadn't been splintered off into a world that made him feel stuck and afraid. No, this was how it should have happened to begin with. He got to go forward with his fellow men into whatever was next. So yeah, Benny walked into the light. He opened his mouth and let out a scream. One of relief, anguish, and every last thing he had pent up inside of him. In doing so, he finally left the darkness behind. Run Fool is a production of Ballen Studios, Campside Media, and At Will Media. It is hosted and executive produced by me, Rodney Barnes. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch and produced by Abakar Adan. Editing by Abakar Adan. Sound director, designer, and mixer is Kevin Seaman. Coordinating producer is Avery Siegel. And artwork by Jessica Clarkston-Kiner. Production support by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. Special thanks to our operations team, Doug Slaywin, Ashley Warren, Sabina Mara, and Destiny Dingle. Executive producers at Ballen Studios are MrBallen, Nick Witters, and Zach Levy. Executive producer at Will Media is Will Malnati. Executive producers at Campside Media are Matt Scher, Josh Dean, Vanessa Gregoriadis, and Adam Hoff. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.